Hi, everyone. Welcome to the To and Through Research Spotlight on college coaching and the transition to college. I'm really excited to be welcoming Dr. Bridgette Davis to be speaking with us today. To get us started, I just want to, before we actually move into our regular program, wanted to share some of the upcoming events from the To and Through project. So the first thing is in a couple of weeks, we are super excited to be having a webinar for the release of a research brief on Elementary on Track, as well as a brand new tool which is looking at elementary school students' grades, attendance, and future outcomes. So this is something you're probably familiar with the high school and community tool that To and Through has had, and this is providing a new lens looking at elementary schools and particularly the middle grades. So we're really excited about that coming out in a couple of weeks. Next up, on November 10th, we're featuring a couple of schools that are part of the To and Through Middle Grades Network, Brighton Park and Columbia Explorers Academy. And we'll be having some practitioners sharing the work that they've been doing to make student work more meaningful. So that's like a really, that'll be, I think, provides a lot of different insights about what's happening in some of our elementary schools. We also have another event that, because we have a lot of really great events here. The next one will be on December. That will be a panel discussion on centering equity and organizational change. And we have two really amazing leaders in Chicago, Jackie Lemon and Rito Martinez. And they'll be giving us a lot of insights into how they have approached equity-centered change efforts inside of their organizations. And then finally, last but not least, on December 6th, Alex Seeskin, the director of the To and Through project, will be leading us through a presentation, which is making the case for making Chicago's selective high schools and colleges less selective. So we have a lot of really great events coming up that hopefully you will be able to join us. And so today, to get started, this is a presentation that I'm really excited about. I think the approach of having college coaches is something that has been used widely by a lot of nonprofits and in schools to really make sure that students are both making their way through high school, avoiding the potholes on the road to college, and then being successful once there. I think Bridgette will be sharing with us some findings from work that she has done on CPS graduates and the role that college coaches played in their journey through college. I think she's going to be providing us some really provocative findings around that. So we're really looking forward to hearing from her. But to give you a couple of logistical pieces around this. I want to make sure that you know that we'll be having a follow-up discussion after this webinar, and we'll be sharing with you the Zoom link at the end of the presentation. And you should also have received that with the invitation that you had for this particular presentation. Also, we will be having some time at the very end for Q&A, and feel free to be dropping questions into the Q&A box throughout the presentation, and we'll be getting to those questions for Bridgette at the end of our time. And I guess just to give you a little bit of background on Bridgette, she is currently an assistant professor of public policy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She earned her PhD in social welfare policy, as well as certificate of education sciences through the IES predoctoral training program at the Crown Family School of Social Work Policy and Practice at the University of Chicago. She's also a two-time Point Foundation Scholar, and her research focuses on the organizational policies and practices that reproduce or challenge social, racial, and economic inequality, among US youth as they navigate the transition to adulthood. I'm really excited to have Dr. Davis with us today. I met her when she was an IAS fellow, and it's really been exciting to see the works that she did through her dissertation and continues to do at University of Massachusetts Amherst. We're also kind of, as a side note, I think we were kind of or I was fangirling, and the rest of us were just kind of really excited because Bridgette is also one of the co-authors on an article that was really instrumental in shaping our thinking around the role that community and institutions play in student outcomes that she did with Dr. Eve Ewing. It brings up this idea of expanded accountability, which has been really influential in our thinking. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Dr. Davis, so she can actually, you can actually hear from her about her findings.
All right, thanks so much, Jenny, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. It's great to be with you from rural Massachusetts. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. It really is this beautiful here, by the way. I just will note that. So I'm going to start a little bit with who I was, who I am, and how I see this work. So I had a path to college that was somewhat similar to many of our students. I grew up in a working class family. I was a first generation college student, but I grew up in a rural area and clearly I'm a white person. I also had a really unique experience, which is my dad began working in a meatpacking plant when he was 18. And then therefore was able to take early retirement when I was in high school. That was offered. It was, that's such an interesting word to describe what was happening in the 90s as corporations were downsizing. But he, in that opportunity, he got the chance to be to take a position as a custodian at a small liberal arts college. And what that meant for me and for my younger sister, unlike our older sisters, was that we had a chance for tuition exchange, which means that I had a very unique experience. While I had to go through bureaucratic processes and use support to actually support my college funding, I had a really different set of situations that happened when I went to the financial aid office and was confused. Because the financial aid officers there presumed that I was a professor's child, because by this time, most staff members and especially workers, like maintenance workers and food service, were not receiving tuition exchange. So I had this positive benefit attributed to me as I was going through college. And I actually had to kind of come out as not that privileged. After my experience with that and attending college, I became incredibly motivated to work on issues of educational equity. And I started my career teaching middle school at Samuel Cohen, which is a school on the southeast side of Atlanta. When I left there and became a program director for Teach for America, I saw all of my students going into high school and saw many of the challenges that we know happens in the transition between 8th grade and high school, which is very disparate outcomes depending on which high school students attended and whether they were tracked into magnet programs or gifted programs from there. That motivated me to return to the classroom. So I taught at Noble. I taught a 9th grade multicultural literature class on the west side of Chicago at Roe Clark Math and Science Academy, and then was a dean of both instruction and college there, and was also a Lone Goal program director. So as my students got older and developed in age, I also kind of moved up along the path with them, and ended up being someone who visited them on colleges' campuses. And now all my former students are, I think, between 28 and 31. So I've been a part of that developmental trajectory. And so that really, I bring that to this work. The other thing I bring to this work, besides the experience being both a college coach and a first generation student and a teacher, is also that I was trained in social welfare and poverty policy at Crown. And that brings, I think, an interesting lens to the work of thinking about what's happening in education. And I think you'll see that today. And then also in this picture, you'll see Loretta Cotton and Joanne Kenner, who are two of my walking friends, because every single day of the PhD program, I spent every Monday through Friday walking with elders that are ages 72 to 94 and Palmer Park. And so I don't mention that I mention that because it really influenced the way I think about inequality and inequality over a life course. And so I will, you'll see that I think as well in today's talk. I'd encourage each of you right now to just think about kind of who you are, what your background is, what you bring to this work, and how you see the problems that our students face, whether that's because you actually identify with the problems in certain areas, and in which areas you may not identify with those problems. All right, so I'm going to briefly just go over this. I think this is why most of us are here, so I don't have to kind of bang the drum on this, but we know that access to college is racialized and classed, and it causes major problems and has continued to over the last 40 years. That sorting that happens to different institutions has appeared, based on research, to be both a product of capital and in terms of college choice. And the opportunities that we provide to low-income students or students of color to actually maximize their potential in terms of these kind of things, right? Test scores, leadership, essays, et cetera. And then also the support that we give in terms of college access. We, I think, have for a long time now, right, the last 20 years, diagnosed this problem as one of equitable opportunity that needs to be provided and supports along the way. And research has really driven the conceptualization of our work in this field of college coaching and college access and success. You know, from Tinto's model of why students leave colleges to really thinking about access as one part of the problem and success as another part of that problem. We have followed both kind of empirical research, theoretical research, and I think we as a field really continue to believe that data collection and really like good research is how we're going to continue to improve and see change in outcomes. And locally and beyond, the potholes data, the data that the consortium started collecting was as the first district that connected with National Student Clearinghouse to high school data. Those data and the stories from potholes really generated an entire field of nonprofits, both across Chicago as kind of a home of that data, and then also nationwide. These programs, right, differ in lots of ways, right, in exact kind of students that they target, whether they're online predominantly or whether they're in person, whether they're school-based, whether they start once students go to college. There's a variety of kind of technologies in these service technologies used in these programs, but really our emergent consensus has been that college coaching is a way to bring about equity in access and success. And right, we see it all over the place with what people are trying to do to innovate. While folks may have quite slightly different models, coaching appears to be really the key component of most of these programs. So my starting question for my study was really why, despite our best efforts and lots of really smart, committed people working on this problem, does this problem still persist? And so this is fundamentally a move that, in terms of design, that is informed by social welfare, poverty, and poverty policy studies, right? So I moved from thinking about the outcomes to actually trying to get inside the process and being inside an intervention. And so the design of the study is longitudinal. I followed students for 2 years. It's multi-level. I was both following students and interviewing them, as well as also spending a great amount of time with coaches within an intervention. And it had a qualitative design. I'll talk to you about why. It also had a mixed methods part of it, but I'll talk to you about why the quantitative analysis wasn't actually completely possible, because it's tied to kind of how we do this work. Participants were 31 average achieving Black students from the very far South Side, the neighborhood that I was living in and walking in every day. The average GPA in terms of 2.3 to 3.2 is really kind of the middle of the threshold for Black students nationwide. The average GPA for Black students is 2.69. So this is really kind of the high end of the distribution right around that. And all the students had right on average a college-ready ACT or SAT. All of the students also importantly had a college prep 9 through 12 schooling experience, which is really important for thinking about, were these students all actually entering kind of in a place to be college bound. All participants were engaged in a college coaching program, and there were 4 main coaches. all of those coaches had lived experience or shared identities with students. And I also was spending time with program managers as well, who also similarly had lived experience or shared identities in particular ways. And then this study took place over 26 months, beginning within 2 weeks of high school graduation with the students. And I conducted over 120 interviews and did over 250 hours worth of participant observation, mostly on the ground with coaches. So what are coaches mostly doing? So what I found, and what many of you may know, and what I present may not be, a shocker to most of you, but what are coaches mostly doing? Much of their time was spent handling what we call administrative burdens. And those are burdens associated with, at its root cause, dealing with need-based financial aid, but both at the federal and state level, and then also as it's implemented by an institution. Administrative burdens is a term that is used in the literature to describe an onerous effect of policy implementation on the people who are trying to access benefits to which they are entitled. Federal verification accounted only for a small fraction of this work. And the way I know that, the work that coaches were doing, the reason I know that federal verification was only a fraction of that work is because there was the pause federally in the second year of the study on verification. And so much of the verification that students were required to deal with and that coaches were supporting them with was coming from the institutional level. And this work, the burdens that were caused by dealing with accessing need-based financial aid had cascading effects. It caused off timing for students. It drove inequitable access to opportunities and resources on campus and led to increasing amounts of burden over time. And I think just for those people in the audience that aren't college coaches or aren't working in financial aid offices, it's really important to just remember that every single institution has the freedom to implement verification how they would like to. So outside of the flags that are required by the federal government, there's actually an incredible amount of freedom to how you implement verification. So put another way, right? This is a federal and state poverty policy program and policy implementation of it that's happening right within colleges. So I want you to think about, right, we know this process. Our students complete forms, they submit them to the federal government. That money is then administered through a college, and then somehow, right, other forms have to be done by the student to then get the funding that they need from the college. That funding is meant to support, right, not only tuition or books, but things like housing, food, very basic needs. Insurance is one of those. And all of that's supposed to be in support of students being able to learn and earn a degree. And so what I saw was that, right, when we talk about coaching, we often are talking about this part, that coaches are helping students access what they need on college campuses to network, to use social capital, to use their human capital, to get tutoring, to do all of these things to be able to succeed in college. However, what I saw on the ground, especially with average achieving students, was that they were often caught in the mess of really spending most of their time trying to deal with bureaucratic processes just to obtain the aid to which students were entitled. So what are the costs of these administrative burdens, right? So we know there's learning costs, right? This is a time attempting to obtain the information, the award letters, and to understand the requirements for verification for the colleges that students wanted to attend. I'll just note that for the students in the study, every single one of the students had a gap between the colleges that they were actually admitted to and the colleges for which they received award letters, despite the schools that they go to and their college coaches following up in terms of making sure they had every single award letter. This delayed decision-making and eliminated decisions. If you only receive 4 award letters and you're admitted to 7 colleges, that means 3 of those colleges can't even really be considered. So that's when verification would happen on the front end before obtaining a letter, right? The second is compliance costs. So the time and the human capital and energy that was spent collecting and submitting documents to prove that they're poor. Ultimately, our students, right, were given, when they were required to collect all of these documents just to prove that they met the benchmark for getting the Pell or state grants. They ultimately experience delays to enrollment and registration. And that's really important because we don't pay attention to a key element here, which is that while our students, we've worked and in terms of what we know as is not always a merit-based admissions process, and we've been skeptical about equity in that lens, we've really not paid a ton of attention to the fact that this after admission, a market-based process unrolls, right? Where students who are advantaged financially very quickly consume, right, the best opportunities on campus. So they get in the best dorms. They very quickly attend the first orientation days and the first visit days. They get the best in the best majors and qualify for those because they connect early. Students that are more advantaged and start early also get chances to be in trio. So even similarly situated programs or students also get access to programs that are preferential and important. So timing really, this compliance cost really causes a problem in terms of timing and access. It also has psychological costs, right? So our students that struggle to get through financial aid processes on their campuses face stigma and negative assumptions in financial aid offices that feel very much like what we know happens in a TANF office. Is, which is that there's a set of developmental costs, which is that yes.
I think we lost you just for a minute there. Go
okay.
Back a slide.
Yep.
I think just
all right.
finishing out the last piece. We heard most of the psychological costs. But
okay. Perfect. Can you still hear me now?
Yep, got you now.
Okay. Okay. So there are also, right, psychological costs, which is that our students face stigma and negative assumptions in financial aid offices and with financial aid officers. And often, right, in the process of trying to get the difficult to find documents and difficult to obtain documents, experience conflict with family, and also experience self-doubt. This can deny or deplete students' sense of belonging, both on college campuses and at home. So then I argue there are also these different kinds of costs, which actually haven't been outlined yet, but I think are unique to this case. Maybe not completely unique to this case, but I think are brought about, are visible because of this case of the transition to college, which is that there's a series of developmental costs, right? Which is that ultimately this process engages young adults in relationships of need, meaning that while our young adults are needing developmentally and wanting to be independent and to be young adults, they actually are constantly having to ask for help, constantly having to ask for documentation from family members when, right, we know the double bind that they're in, which is students are asked to take on these loans as if they are solely responsible and adults, but simultaneously they have to get all of their family's documentation to prove, right, that they are low income and they qualify for these opportunities. Also, the coaching relationship, right, has a developmental cost as well. Students specifically talk about and identify the way that coaching feels like getting pushed through college by an outside organization versus when they receive similar help from folks that work on college campuses. It feels like getting pulled in, being welcomed, and being cared for within the college setting. And the implicit message, right, that our young people get as they navigate federal and state financial aid to which they are entitled, right, is you're not capable of independently navigating this. I want to just pause there for a second because I think there are implications that we know about and we can think of in the proximate, right? Just like what happens on a college campus when a student's getting that kind of a message. But I think there's bigger, broader political implications as well, right? In terms of believing that actually the system is not made for our students to be able to navigate. It's made difficult on purpose, right? And that ultimately, right, divests students in thinking that policy can and should work for them, right, which can have huge political ramifications as well. So it also has actual costs, right? It causes what I know is a series of cumulative disadvantages that kind of cascade from here. So when students don't get equal access to opportunity and resources on campus, they have a lack of choice, in courses. They have a lack of choice in majors. They have a lack of choice in dorms. They have a lack of choice in jobs on campus. And it stratifies campus opportunity. And that's by class, but it's so visible by racial identity and difference. This causes students to experience additional course failures if you end up in 8 a.m. courses of psychology and chemistry in your first semester, because that's what's left. That's starting out in a really unequal footing. It also lengthens time to degree. Students end up having to retake courses that were courses or take additional courses because they were not able to take the courses they would have wanted to take or needed to take for a major or for gen eds. It also increases costs and debt, eliminates students from lucrative majors and programs because they fill up early, and ceases financial aid eligibility. We all know this, that by third term, students with too many failures or lower GPAs, right, can be dropped from financial aid altogether. So the broad way of thinking about this is that the existing policies don't accommodate life's complexity for our most vulnerable students, right? So who was this really most affecting? So average achieving students who attended large public institutions, right, faced the biggest challenge in my study. So complicated systems and multiple portals with little support from campus workers really made for a kind of a major set of challenges around financial aid and around verification. Those whose families were least stable or advantaged, and I want to think about this, all of the students in the study were Pell eligible, all of them qualified for the MAP grant. So the difference is not a difference that's in numerical category, but the difference is actually kind of one of a microclass, meaning that families with one or more members who had received a means tested program, so qualified for disability, qualified for TANF, qualified for unemployment at different points, they had way more, not only were more likely to be actually pulled for verification, but had a much more difficulty in actually getting through verification processes where it took time and was even more onerous. And then also families with one or more member who had precarious or gig economy work. I don't think I think where people on the ground working know how difficult it is for our students' families to be able to come up with all the documentation they need. We haven't even conceived of the fact yet that like many of the families in my study were working multiple gig economy jobs, had gotten, for example, kicked off an Uber app because of a low rating, and then had almost no access to actually coming up with an I-9, right? So those families who had at least one person in their family who worked a 40-hour-a-week job, even if it was a low wage job, and could get a W-2 from an actual office or person, they could get through verification with relatively little difficulty. And then the other is that students that experience complex or family trauma that was related to other systems involvement also had additional barriers in providing documentation for verification. So students who were DCFS engaged and received some additional supports, or whose family did and financially, those whose family members had experienced untimely deaths, either of siblings or of adults in the family, where the gap between tax completion 2 years prior and then that there had been a death in the family that would be an unexpected death, often they had to prove and provide certificates of death to financial aid offices. And then those who experienced eviction and needed to come up with paperwork often had a difficult time. So this is an intersecting and complicated issue where the policy doesn't acknowledge what it really means to be low income in this moment in this economy. So what does this mean for coaching programs? So the successes that I saw on the ground were that coaches completely tackled summer melt, right? 100% of the students that intended to enroll in college after high school year all enrolled, which is a huge success and definitely is very different than what we saw in the potholes study, right? Coaches also were fantastic at navigating. I happened to be collecting data during the pandemic, and when students were getting sent home from campuses during their freshman year, as the pandemic began, coaches were incredibly effective at getting them actual material supports, plane tickets, bus tickets, places to store their things if they had a lot of things on campus. So they did all of these things. Yet the how and the timing of access to college, right, when they actually enrolled in college and registered for classes, had a cascading effect on the likelihood of success given differential access to campus resources. So although all the students enrolled, the later that a student enrolled, right, the more likely it was that they would have a set of challenges that persisted not only in first semester but beyond. There also was an issue with, there's kind of a collapsing of set of intersecting categories. So as these different kind of rates or like different stories would unfold of success that was related to kind of paperwork and handling things, coaches often drew within group comparisons, right? They had a caseload of students. Those caseload of students went to a number of different kinds of colleges. And often when talking about the issues that students were facing, there would be quick generalizations drawn that had to do kind of with achievement or on itness, like that person's so on it, they always get all their paperwork in, everything's been done, they've handled everything, they have a job already, right? But without really knowing or thinking about the different starting point that students came with when they came on their caseload. So for example, as we all know, more elite college students do the CSS profile in the fall, and that means that they get their financial aid award letters with admissions, right? That means that none of these students faced verification challenges later because the bureaucracy was on the front end, the burden was on the front end. And so often there was assumptions that these students who are at more elite schools actually were following through better or more motivated to follow through, or their parents were more invested, et cetera. That may be true, but that's really a conflated issue. And so this was, I think, one challenge that came up for coaches. And so, again, what does it mean for coaching programs? Well, the current approach, right, places coaches with lived experience or shared identities in a place to just consistently observe inequity. Over and over again, the most disadvantaged students will continue to struggle in college, and it will again, right, look as if they potentially are less motivated, their parents are not on board, or these other pieces, right? And it really allows our coaches, no matter how frustrated they are with these inequities, it allows them very little contribution to more structural solutions. They're just stuck, right, one by one, helping students, right, through these onerous processes, all the while knowing that they may be set up, right, for a disadvantaged kind of experience. So what's the opportunity and why is this important? So I think the opportunity of coaching programs is that we aren't really currently collecting data that is goal destructive. And ultimately that's perpetuating inequality and our assumptions about inequality and the ways that it works. So unlike corporations or flight navigators, we don't collect data on these parts of the policy that are destructive. We've accepted them as kind of in the water, but they are socially and politically constructed. We don't collect data specifically on generally, coaching programs don't collect data specifically on verification in terms of an award letter. We collected on award letters in terms of students obtaining them, but we don't collect them timed, either of these processes. When are students flagged for verification, by which institutions, right? What is the timing of that? What's the timing on when they get actually a response for those verifications? And do we actually time and actually, right, the categories of time actually taking care of when students enroll by time or date, and how that actually, right, correlates with success or lack of success. And these problems, the other opportunity is that these problems, right, provide insight into our public institutions' biggest challenges. So we have an invested set of stakeholders kind of at all levels, and coaching programs are actually in a unique position to have the data. So what could it mean for policy advocacy to state, the federal government, or institutions, right? I would argue we did this as a field. We did this with documented students, undocumented students, and even undocumented parents in terms of advocating for a way for them to participate in financial aid. And when we did this, we won. And I think here we're really uniquely positioned. We get this insight between the policy, the institution, and the student. I think we also have an opportunity for practice changes. By generating more fine-grained categories, we can better predict and plan for and support students with complex financial contexts. This is information we can find out very early on in senior year. It's things we can start collecting the documents for and making sure that students are prepared for it. We can basically prepare for verification from the very start, so that we're able to get through it quickly when it happens, and potentially even try to help students advocate for almost a pre-verification process as soon as they get admission. So ideally, right, we would be able to put ourselves out of business, or better yet, because I believe every single student still deserves an adult who cares about them and has been through similar experiences supporting them, right? It better yet, we would shift our focus and energy. And what I mean by that is that, right, we have this process. We could stop spending all of our time here, start spending our time really thinking about supporting students academically and in terms of their career prospects for afterwards. I want to just acknowledge, before we go into questions, I just want to acknowledge I had two former students who were Noble alumni, and also One Goal alumni, who actually worked on the project and coded interviews and supported my analysis throughout the process. That's Ebony Turner and Aaliyah Young. I want to thank the Noble Schools College team for all the work they did in supporting the project. And then I also was funded throughout my time in my PhD program and for this study by multiple funders. So thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Bridgette. I think it's like really just helpful way, new lens to kind of think about the role that college coaches playing. And I'm sure like college coaches don't go into the business so they can be managing financial aid and other types of administrative burdens. They want to be with students. So I think this is a lot of food for thought here. So I'll start with questions. Actually, I'm going to answer one question that we already answered. I think somebody had asked about whether or not the recording will be available afterwards. And we'll be sending a link to the video in an email after this, after this is over, and it will also be available on UEI's YouTube channel. And you can actually see other previous research spotlights there as well. But I will kick this off with like the first question. I mean, you started talking about this a little bit. I mean, there's an enormous amount of administrative burden that's being borne by college coaches and by students. I mean, how would you where would you start, or what would you think could change at the college level or at the federal or state policy level? Like what changes could we have there? You're talking about like advocating for this, but what would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of different ways it could look, right? And I think what we have to acknowledge is that there's kind of two things we're up against in terms of what verification and financial aid complexity is about, right? One is that, comes from ideologically, comes from the left. In some ways, it's that good government is technocratic and is efficient, and we build these online systems that then don't always work out that way, right? The other thing we're up against, though, is folks usually ideologically from the right who believe that we need to be protecting against fraud. So I think if you're thinking about kind of both of those concerns and you're thinking about what we could do, right, there are plenty of solutions. Sue Donarski and Judah Scott Clayton, right, argue that we don't need a FAFSA at all. That actually, if you use IRS data, you could send families a letter when a child is in sophomore year that says, here's actually, if you use like an average of 5 years of data, you could actually say, you're eligible for the federal and state grants. Here's what your college, right? Here's what financial aid would look like for you. And it doesn't require kind of anything. And then families could also pre-plan for that kind of support. So that's like one really, completely, it's gone, right? Another is actually that it could we've moved the FAFSA already to October, right? Another is that all of the verification processes happen on the front end, very much like the CSS profile. That's what happens with our high achieving students. Then they get in a letter with admissions, right? That's one way to advocate for a change. I think another way to advocate for change is thinking about, if we're concerned about fraud, we actually know as a country, right, that zip code is a very good predictor of income. We could ask institutions to actually, right, just look at the zip code or the census tract to know whether or not it's likely that that family is committing fraud, and go from there. I think there's a number of other possible solutions, but I think that's one of, I mean, that's a set of them. But I do think we have to think at all levels, because I think the assumption that if the federal government makes it easier, that institutions will also do away with verification or complexity, I think we actually can't assume that. As evidenced by when the pause was set on verification, most institutions still required verification for many low-income students, and especially those with kind of the challenging set of conditions.
Great, thank you. And I do encourage everybody to start dropping questions into the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. We do have a couple of other questions, but I'm sure after hearing Bridgette's presentation, there's a lot of lingering questions that people will have. So the first, another question that's here is like, how does the sense of being pushed through college by college coaches differ from the sense of being pushed by family members for more advantaged students? So like you sort of talked about this, like how is this different, like, you know, experientially in reactions?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a couple ways I'll answer this. So I think first, right. I think first I'll say that the college coaching is not just like, it's not just informal, and it's not just an important relationship. And so students would often talk about being pushed through, and they'd specifically talk about like, they want my data. I matter because I matter to their outcomes, right? That's a message that our students get not only by their requests to participate in kind of funding opportunities or their requests to share their stories, but they very much understand that a mission-driven organization, like they are a point of data, their data is being collected, and it's not just like an altruistic push. So I'd say that, right? I think the second piece is that I think actually what's really interesting is this idea, and a lot of college coaching, right, comes from us saying, this is what high income students get. I want to deconstruct that in a couple of ways, right? Because high income students, I think, get a lot of things, and I think we sometimes get wrong what they get, right? I think we think they go through rational actor models of getting every single award letter and then comparing them and then picking the most affordable and best college through some matrix of rational decision making. I think what we actually know by what students do, given that many of them, even if they go to public institutions or get into the honors colleges at public institutions, that they very, very quickly decide, they very quickly take advantage of all the opportunities on campus. And so it's actually like the idea that this, like even decision day happening in May for our students, that is not when decisions are made by high income students. And so I think if we just kind of ask ourselves, like, what are our maybe misconceptions about what's happening for high income students? The other reality is, like, high income students, their parents often are doing this for them. That's the other, and they aren't required to do any of these processes. If you're not actually going to take federal financial aid, you're not ever flagged for verification. You don't have to do any of these bureaucratic processes. And so I think I think there's just a whole set of dynamics, right? If our coaches were able to just push our students academic, like what students are navigating.
Yeah. Oops, sorry, Bridgette, we lost like about 10 seconds of what you just said, unfortunately.
Okay, sorry about that. Am I back?
Yeah, back.
Okay, I just said that if coaches were actually really able to focus on the academic pushes and the like social and kind of networking pushes, it might actually feel like what does happen in higher income families, but instead these pushes are attached to these bureaucratic processes that are just minimal things to be involved and to be enrolled and get kind of basic needs met at college.
Great, thanks. So we also have a question about data. I mean, you talked a lot about the importance of data, but there's a question about who do you see as being responsible for collecting the data that you're talking about as being really, really critical? I mean, is this something that like
Mm.
institutions should do, researchers, nonprofits, school districts? Like where would this be coming from?
Yeah, I mean, I think institutions may have this data by putting together very complex sets of data from different sides of their, right, from financial aid and then from admissions. I think it's possible that those data sets could be built by researchers. But I think it's to me, it's there's a whole notion in social welfare policy and history about the idea of doing both wholesale and retail work. And the idea of that is thinking about right on the ground service work with people that are experiencing problems and simultaneously taking those learnings up to think about kind of policy advocacy and policy change. I actually think that college, like the mission driven college coaching programs are best positioned because you get an angle on this entire process. They collect that data anyways. It's just not organized by time or date. And do I think researchers have a responsibility? Of course. I mean, I think everyone has a responsibility, but I think the opportunity is really the contribution that college coaching organizations could make next.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So we also have a question about kind of changes that have happened over time. So like given that this was a longitudinal study, and I'll add this myself, given like your long experience with
Yeah.
the college access and college success landscape, you know, how did you observe the college support landscape evolving over the course of your study? Are there some processes that you feel have gotten better? Is there anything that got worse? Obviously, there's like a pandemic in the middle of this too, but just sort of describing the changes that you've kind of observed over time.
Yeah, I'd say the changes I've observed over time is that I think more colleges are talking about this kind of like one-stop shop and
Mhm.
support to make things easier. I think where I saw that successful was in smaller programs that have made a conscious effort to do so and have the staffing available to support students. I think large public institutions, I don't know that even if they've attempted to make their letters look more readable or have attempted to make things kind of more streamlined, I think that our students still just faced a disproportionate amount of verification challenges, and like difficulty in terms of getting through the verification process. I also think that particularly at large public institutions, um, everything's path dependent, as required by the institution.
Mhm.
Whereas if you're attending a smaller program or smaller liberal arts college,
Mhm.
or even a small community college program, not small, I'll make
Mhm.
that clear. I think there's interesting ways in which there's more egalitarian access to course
Mhm.
registration or to dorms because that process happens later. It doesn't happen kind of stepwise from admissions on. So it's something about clearly the large amount of scale and trying to fill in spots that is happening at public institutions. I'd say the other, in terms of change over time, I think the biggest change is that college success programs have gotten really good at getting our students through this,
Mhm.
um, and we've really understood. I think if you talk to many of the professionals that are here, we've gotten really good at understanding all of the steps that it's going to take to get through verification to get students enrolled. I think we haven't gotten great at understanding the consequences, even if we get through that process.
Great,
Yeah.
thanks. So there's also a question about community colleges. And so what role did community colleges play, if any, in your study
Mhm.
or in students' decision making? And and this is coming from me, I just kind of be interested in how you sort of think about this as playing out in community colleges, and like the issues that you've surfaced.
Yeah. So there were actually two really interesting things happening right during at the start of the study. So at the time, city colleges specifically, which is the community college set that most of the students would have considered, or were some of the students were considering, um, they had a really difficult time because students were being dropped, like as a policy, students were being dropped if their courses hadn't been paid for by a particular date, but the financial aid was coming in later than that date. And so students would be dropped from courses and then have to re-enroll in courses. There was, at the time, this coaching program that I was embedded within was doing a ton of work around advocacy and supporting students with just making a payment on a payment plan so that they could stay enrolled. And it was another success I clearly saw was leveraging institutional money and organizational money to actually support students. But I think community college students, community college, I think, face a particularly tough problem, which is they serve more flagged for verification. And so they too, right, are actually also, they actually also are having an outsized burden on their financial aid offices to actually process verification. And so I think we see those problems become kind of compounded, whereas a student is not one of only 50 students that are getting flagged for verification. They're one of many. And when they go to the office to get help, it's often incredibly busy and really tough to get the support you would need. So I think community colleges and less selective colleges are often also at the same disadvantage that our most disadvantaged students are at. It's also an institutional disadvantage.
Yeah, and I guess then the next question I have is actually about your current institution. I mean, how does this look at UMass Amherst? And if you actually talk to them about what their processes look like?
Yeah, so I'm really starting to kind of piece that together.
I know it looks like we're losing Bridgette. Okay, let's give it like 20 seconds and hopefully Bridgette's connection will resume. Oh, hi, Bridgette. Unfortunately, we missed, I think, most of what you said here. I'm sorry.
I didn't answer because
Okay.
No, it's okay. So in terms of what is happening at UMass Amherst, it's been, I've been trying to obtain that information and really understand it. I will say that one of the biggest indicators for me that things are not all as seamless as we would hope is that there's ways that people talk all very informally around campus about who lives where and why, and their assumptions are that it's all about kind of identity and belonging and where students want to be with, to be in kind of a homophilous situation. But the reality, right, is that my suspicion about that is actually that's far, preference is far less important in terms of driving that. And that if there are students that are ending up in particular dorms that are far away from everything on central air, that's not just the case of preference, right? That's the case of there being inequity in this process. But it's really interesting. I've thought about a next study being potentially within a financial aid office.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, we only have 5 minutes left, so hopefully this will be a quick question. So how do programs like QuestBridge, which remove a lot of the choice from students, fit into the findings of this work? Something that's a lot more structured.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, Jenny?
Okay, so sorry, the question, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with this program. I'm not super familiar, but QuestBridge, so it's a program that moves a lot of the choice from students around things. How does this fit into the findings that you have?
Yeah, so I would say that the way that you could think about QuestBridge or any program like that, like Posse, or any of these programs that actually talk about kind of the top maybe 5 to 2% of students and think about structuring their set of opportunities, I think we have to think of that as it's a totally separate process than this that I'm describing. And that's largely not only because of the way the organization intervenes, but it's because of the way financial aid works for elite students and early decision deciders. All of the most selective schools in the country require the CSS profile. And ultimately that means that students, when they get admitted, get a financial aid award letter. And so most of these other kinds of programs that are working within elite schools, right, aren't facing the same set of bureaucratic challenges. They may face other challenges of belonging. They may face other challenges of students feeling very stratified on campus, but usually it does not have this structural element of stratification that's caused by the process of obtaining financial aid itself.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think we'll have to unfortunately end questions here, but I really appreciate your responding to all the different questions. And I guess I want to thank everybody in our audience for being here, and particularly thank you, Bridgette, for your presentation. I think there's a lot to think about, both from the college coaching perspective and what can be changed in both on college campuses and larger policy questions. I also want to encourage people. I think there's a lot. I always do better when I have a chance to process something that I heard, and so we have our follow-up time in Zoom. So we'll be guys, thank you, Jessica, for dropping the link in. We'll be starting that in probably like 2 minutes. As soon as we're done here, we'll be moving over there, but it'll give everybody an opportunity to engage with each other about what Bridgette talked to us today. So thank you, everybody who's been listening to this, and thank you, Bridgette, so much. I really appreciate it, and really felt like I learned a lot and have a lot of thoughts running through my head right now. So have a good
Thank
day,
you.
everybody.